River Rat Studios would like to thank the following Southwest Louisiana businesses for sponsoring this presentation. We support local business and they support us. If you or your business would like to sponsor future content, please contact us at this social media platform. The area, present-day southwest Louisiana, was originally inhabited by a succession of Native American tribes going back several thousand years before Columbus. The most recent of these were predominantly the Caddo and Attakapai, who thrived in the dense pine forest and wetlands between the Red River and the Gulf of Mexico. With the arrival of the first European explorers, these tribes would slowly be pushed out of the region and ultimately displaced by Spanish, French, and eventually American settlers, who began to move into the area as early as the mid-17th century. At the conclusion of the French and Indian War in North America, Spain had taken possession of all French territory south of the Great Lakes, but by 1803 the region had reverted back to France, setting up a series of events that would see Louisiana succeeded to 3 different countries in less than a year. The odd streams of history would converge in 1803, when the power-drunk Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, gave up on his ambitions in North America after the French army was driven out of Haiti at the end of the Haitian slave revolt, giving birth to the second independent republic in the New World. Initially, President Thomas Jefferson sought only to buy the critical port city of New Orleans and the region of the lower Mississippi, but Napoleon suddenly offered to sell the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, and after some hesitation over the constitutionality of such a large transfer of government funds and the limits to the power of the federal government, Jefferson agreed to the deal. Truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, as it was the Bank of England that financed a good portion of the $15 million transaction, the modern equivalent of roughly $250 billion. The British government allowed the loan to take place, even though it knew full well that Napoleon would use the proceeds made from the sale of Louisiana to finance his wars of conquest in Europe and his impending conflict with Britain, partially in the vain hope that those land-hungry Americans would be too preoccupied with such a large unsettled territory to the west to contemplate a march on British-held Canada to the north. The purchase of the vast Louisiana Territory would go down as the largest real estate deal in history, and not only more than double the size of the barely 27-year-old country, but would begin America's expansion across the continent to the Pacific. It was nothing short of a miracle that Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana to the United States in 1803. Had the young American Republic not acquired the territory prior to Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1814, it's very likely that the British Empire would have ended up with the territory at the end of its decade-long war with Napoleonic France, possibly ending any ambitions America had of expanding beyond the Mississippi to the west coast. And modern Canada would stretch across the heartland of the present-day United States to the Gulf of Mexico, leaving the U.S. permanently confined to its original territory along the Atlantic seaboard. For nearly 20 years between 1803 and 1821, Southwest Louisiana was a land in limbo. The United States had acquired the vast Louisiana Territory from Napoleonic France, but the exact boundaries of the region weren't clearly specified in the final agreement. The Spanish Empire west of the Sabine claimed the region as far north as the Red River and as far east as the Calcasieu, while the newly born United States Republic claimed the area to the Sabine River. In order to avoid an armed conflict, Both sides quietly reached a mutual understanding that the disputed territory would be off limits to the jurisdictions of both nations and governments, and that all military and policing activities would be conducted with the express approval of both nations or in conjunction with each other. A shade larger than the modern nation-state of Israel, the neutral zone was a land of pirates, fugitives, and your run-of-the-mill scallywags. It was also a safe haven for runaway slaves and home to the original native tribes who inhabited the region. Seen as nothing more than a trackless wilderness of endless forests, malaria-infested swamps, briar patches, and thickets that seemed to be cursed by every type of deadly creature on earth, from man-eating alligators, packs of flesh-hungry wolves, bloodthirsty wildcats like cougars and bobcats, and venomous snakes such as cottonmouths, ground rattlers, and water moccasins. But of all the demon-possessed critters that still thrive in this region, the mosquitoes are the worst. Trust me. It was the birthplace of the Wild West and the dawn of the first long-distance cattle drives between the then young United States and outposts of the old Spanish Empire. It was here where the legend of the American cowboy first captured the popular imagination and the first trails to the American West were blazed. It could be said that a small piece of modern America as we know it was carved out of the sultry subtropical climate of southwest Louisiana. It wasn't a completely lawless land. In fact, small detachments of the American and Spanish armies were periodically sent in to flush out renegades, bandits, and bands of outlaws, and to give some semblance of law and order to the area. At times, slave-hunting parties would show their ugly faces in search of runaway slaves, who fled to the neutral strip to escape a grim life on the early plantations along the Mississippi River, with some coming from as far off as Georgia and the Carolinas, and others from as far off as Virginia and Maryland, in search of freedom in the dense forests of no man's land, or to cross over in the Spanish-held Texas, then known as Norte Mexico. Of all the cutthroat smugglers and rum runners who passed through this Louisiana no man's land, none were as well known or as infamous as the pirate Jean Lafitte. Lafitte cut a wide swath of illegal trade across the Gulf Coast and Caribbean, bringing every type of contraband under the sun to the shores of the North American mainland, through this small strip of Louisiana between the Calcasieu and Sabine rivers. The long list of cargo his ships transported ranged from hard liquor, firearms, and slaves, from the coast of Africa and the region around the Caribbean. Lafitte and his band of pirates would spark the development of Galveston, Texas as an important port city, and go on to prove essential in General Andrew Jackson's victory over the British in 1815, during the Battle of New Orleans at the tail end of the War of 1812, and would receive a full and absolute pardon from the U.S. government in return. Jean Lafitte would be remembered as the last of the well-known Gulf Coast pirates and Caribbean sea bandits, and would die in 1823 in Central America, bringing a final end to the era of organized rum running and illegal smuggling in the Atlantic, as the last of the great pirate ships in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast region sailed off into the sunset and forever into history. Today, the city of Lake Charles hosts the annual Pirate Festival, formerly known as Contraband Days, to pay its respects to the region's unsavory roots during the days of the no man's land period of Louisiana's history. The festival lasts for 12 days in May and has a yearly attendance of around 200,000 people, making it second only to Mardi Gras the most popular attraction in not only the state but also across the Gulf Coast region. During the nearly 2 decades of the neutral zone period, Southwest Louisiana became home to some of the most wanted men in North America. Some were on the run for everything from cold-blooded murder, armed robbery, cattle rustling, and horse theft. Others were simply on the run from debt collectors and a stint in debtor's prison. And yet some simply wanted to brave the volatile weather and harsh humid climate to carve out a meager living on small family-sized farms or to try their luck in the lucrative fur trade. The roots of the port of Lake Charles, Louisiana, and eventually the city itself, can be traced back to the illegal trade that took place across the neutral strip during the early days of the Louisiana Territory. Present-day Port Arthur, Texas was also another hub for smuggled contraband flowing into southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas and the surrounding region during that era, that would later spark the development of the western Gulf Coast as a vital hub for domestic and international commerce. Without this, the cities and vital ports of Lake Charles and Port Arthur may never have existed, and the Kansas City Southern Railroad would probably have been routed further west towards Galveston, Texas. Without that rail line, smaller cities such as Leesville, DeRidder, and DeQuincy most likely would have never been developed. The days of lawlessness ended in 1819, when the U.S. Army finally moved in and fully occupied the neutral strip, shortly after General Andrew Jackson's expedition in the Spanish-held Florida. Spain was still in the throes of upheaval following the Napoleonic Wars, and its colonial holdings all across Latin America were on the verge of revolt, and it was in no position to contest the American encroachments into what the Spanish saw as unimportant areas of its sprawling but very fragile and troubled empire. With the final ratification of the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1821, the boundaries of present-day southwest Louisiana were permanently established on the Sabine River, and its 20 years as an ungoverned region were at last at an end. The illegal smuggling and criminal trading activities that once thrived in the old neutral zone effectively ceased almost overnight, and the criminals and gangs of outlaws fled west or simply melted into the trickles of new settlers to the region. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 not only settled the boundaries of southwest Louisiana, but also ended the long-simmering dispute between the United States and the Spanish Empire over what was then called Oregon Country in the Pacific Northwest, and opened the way for the gradual settlement of the American West for the rest of the 19th century. By 1823, Spain's Latin American colonies were plunged into revolt and would eventually gain their independence from the Spanish crown. By 1848, the new Republic of Mexico would lose the entirety of its northern territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War that firmly established the United States as a full-fledged continental nation and the leading power in not only North America but the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, which opened the way for its rise to become the world's dominant economic and military powerhouse by the early and mid-20th century. Throughout the 19th century, the fur trade and agricultural-based economy of southwest Louisiana would slowly be supplanted by the timber and railroad companies, and finally the oil and natural gas industries in the early and mid-20th century. By the 1980s, this area of Louisiana would become a critical link in the great refinery belt. It stretches across the Gulf Coast from Corpus Christi, Texas, to Tampa, Florida, and forms the backbone of American industry and plays a vital role in the domestic and global economy. In more recent times, it has been opened up to plastics manufacturing and chemical processing. Though still a predominantly rural region by comparison to the more populated and industrialized southeastern area of the state, southwest Louisiana is slowly becoming a more developed and urbanized area, with its largest metropolitan area being the city of Lake Charles on the southern end of the Calcasieu River. The combined parishes that made up the old neutral zone today have a population of just under 300,000 residents. One of several large freshwater islands that form central and south Louisiana, surrounded by three great rivers and their tributaries in the Gulf of Mexico. Southwest Louisiana has grown from an obscure semi-tropical wilderness into a region that connects the Gulf Coast and plays a critical part in the life of modern America and helps power the planet. Over the course of the decades, centuries, and even eons, this stretch of Louisiana has seen its share of storms, hard times, and the changes that comes with the passing of every sunset and the birth of every dream born under the stars, while still maintaining its wild natural beauty and the charm of its unique roots, cultural traditions, and its history.